we might even engage with the solutions. And so, what is the kinetic city for me is it's a city, it's a form of urbanism that is elastic. It is about incrementalism. Things get built in increments. There are no absolute solutions. That means you have to have people who can bring sweat equity, increments of investment. It's about appropriation and deappropriation and reappropriation of space, which people use for something on a temporal scale. And it's about soft thresholds where these binaries actually dissolve. And you see that happening in our cities. The way we are building our cities now is we are hardening these binaries, between what is private, public, inside, outside. And what's really interesting, I think, in contemporary India is things that have to be completely private, like weddings, are becoming incredibly public, and things like space, which should be public, are becoming private. So there's a whole inversion here, which is going to be very dangerous in a funny way for our society. So whether it's religion, whether it's weddings, things which were traditionally incredibly private are becoming spectacles, and vice versa. And I think these are the kinds of things we have to be careful about. I call this the 5 stages of squatting. It's linked to the index of security. This is the most insecure person, so they have a blanket, they can pick up their things and run when the police come. That guy has bribed his way into the system, so he's become more permanent. It's the 5 stages, and if you look at this, this is how most of our city, or let me say half our city is made, not all of our city, where you have these increments that sort of occur. And now we are building buildings like this, no criticism of this building, but these are creating these disparities. So what is the right urban form that can accommodate both these things? Is a question I think we have to very urgently look at. This beautiful game, as they said, British Nandi said, this beautiful Indian game that the British invented, the Maidans in Mumbai, in the evenings they're used for weddings, right? This is the kinetic city. The pitch is sacred, no one touches it. They wrap the wedding around, the club members share samosas from the same kitchen, and in the morning, this disappears. It's on a temporal scale, it goes back to cricket. So the kinetic city is about how transactions are made, which are different, and this is the mapping we've done in the book. This is what interests me. It's unstable, which means public spaces for festivals become temples, or they become mosques, so they get appropriated in a particular place but reappropriated and deappropriated. Habitation is a much more complex aspect of it. The spectacles are festivals. Buildings are not the spectacle of the kinetic city. It is people and motion in space and appropriation of space. And it challenges the idea of the city as a static and a stable entity, because it's always shifting, its images are shifting, its form is shifting in space. And so it's very different from this. I call this the landscape of impatient capital, because capital is inherently impatient, and the territories like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Shanghai, all autocracies, not democracies, when they prepare the ground for capital to land and to manifest its value, those become the landscapes of impatient capital. It's a very brittle urban form and not very adaptable. And our cities, the kinetic city, is where these occur together. And here, the Ganesh festival, for example, here immersion becomes really a metaphor for the spectacle of the city, because as the clay idol really dissolves in the water of the bay, the spectacle comes to a close. There are no static or permanent mechanisms to encode this spectacle. Here, the spectacle of the city, the memory of the city, is an enacted moment. It's a moment in time which leaves a memory for you to yearn to bring back the next year. So it has a temporal kind of rhythm. There are no permanent mechanisms to encode the city, but the kinetic city appropriates the static city, and it's the coming together of the two that is creating the spaces where this could happen. In the landscapes of impatient capital, this doesn't happen because the static city overwhelmingly appropriates space in terms of the image formation. So the kinetic city as an idea cannot be seen as a design tool. I want to clarify that, at least for my architect friends. Rather, it's a demand that conceptions of urbanism create and facilitate environments that are versatile, flexible, robust, and ambiguous enough to allow the kinetic quality of the city to flourish. And that is how people can also associate in space, etc. So, taking these principles forward, I'll show you the next research, which was mapping the ephemeral megacity, the Kumbh Mela, which is, as you know, just gotten over. I did this 12 years ago. It was quite different. It wasn't hype. I think we were the most VIP people there because we were coming 40 people from the university to map it. Now there are helicopters and things landing there. And it was an incredible experience for many reasons. We called it mapping the ephemeral megacity because it is ephemeral and it is a megacity because in the definition of megacities it's over 7 million people who live there for 55 days. Don't believe, I don't get into trouble, but don't believe any of the numbers that you're hearing. It's impossible for 400 million people to be there and all of that. The university, Harvard Business School with scientists actually took aggregated data from Airtel. That was the first Kumbh Mela where cell phones appeared 12 years ago. Previously, 24 years ago, there wouldn't have been cell phones, so they got aggregated data and they determined 76 million people had gone there. They factored in families, 3 people per cell phone, etc. You multiply that to 120 million, that would be the max even this year, I believe. And those also come in 5 days, 20 million, 10 million. And I believe, from what I understood on the ground, was that a lot of these numbers are inflated to get bigger budgets, which then becomes money that sloshes around. So it's a megacity where 7 million people live there for 55 days. So it's an ephemeral megacity. It has all the attributes of the city. I think, by now, probably all of you have been to the Kumbh, I don't know, but this is just some images which tell you a little bit about the Kumbh Mela. That's the Sangam where the dip happens. These are the different akhadas waiting for their time to go and make it. They get the priority. And it has all the attributes of a city, infrastructure, water, sanitation. It's the cleanest Indian city I've lived in for those 10 days. Clinics, hospitals. These are the processions on the important days. These are the langas where you can go anywhere and get fed. It's just quite amazing. Now it goes crazy. This was for an installation, so. But anyway, this is what the landscape looks like. It was an incredible interdisciplinary work at the university because no school, we were 7 schools who went there, no school had ownership on how to understand it. And so the design school students had no idea, what are we going to go map a megacity? The public health people were freaking out. The religious school, the divinity school were the only ones who had some sense of what the ritualistic frameworks were, at least. But it became a truly interdisciplinary project, and interdisciplinarity comes when no discipline owns it. Because if any discipline begins to take a lead, you begin to have a lead from a discipline. So that was one very important aspect. Now, this is a whole lecture in itself, which I've done in Ahmedabad, but I just want to highlight a few things that might be important. This is how, when in October, after the monsoon, the Ganga and the Yamuna and the waters recede, on the sandbanks is how a grid is laid out and a city is made. It's a light city, there are no foundations. It sits as lightly as a city could possibly sit. Those are images that we took in October when it was in flood. That's the same tree from the same spot. And by the time November, December, a whole city emerges. Now, people use the term pop-up city. That's not true. It's very deliberate. It's a state enterprise. It's planned for a year or two in advance. It's a big, big, big operation. And a whole city emerges in 8 weeks, which is housing 7 million people. It's quite mind-blowing if you think of it as an operation, which is what it's a grid that gets employed, so it's very robust. Every street on the grid goes across as a bridge, so it's incredibly resilient if there's a flood or unseasonal rain, etc. This is a wonderful image by Dinesh Mehta, a photographer, because we couldn't use drones, we couldn't get permission for drones, but we had someone from the law school read the rules and we found there was nothing that stopped us from putting a camera on a kite. So these were all taken from a kite because there was no rule that had anticipated a kite for photography. So these are images of the Kumbh Mela. You see a perfect grid. You see every street goes across as a bridge. Now, a couple of things that for me were very interesting. The entire Kumbh Mela above the ground is made out of these 5 materials. Bamboo that is 8 feet tall, screws or nails, string or rope, and skinning materials, corrugated sheet or textile or plastic or something that can skin. But these are the only 5 materials that the entire city is made of, going from temples, that's 8 feet, the red line you see, to a single family tent. So it's a real kit of parts, but it allows an amazing variation and it allows it to be dismantled also very easy. That's the logic by which it can be made so quickly and dismantled so quickly. The other thing that I found incredibly interesting, and we did this through a research where we got a grant to bring all the administrators of the Mela to the university for 4 days, lock them in a room, and just question them. There was no handbook, nothing was written. We just asked them questions and questions, and that's how we came up with this chart, which shows the complexity of the governance. And what you see in yellow is what you see in red are political decisions, what you see in yellow are bureaucratic decisions, and what you see in blue is the Mela Adhikari going on the ground, which means just 6 months before the Mela, this guy gets all the power and he has to only report to 2 people. That's how he can be so, or she can be so effective. And this is of course the last day. So I just want to go back to that for a second, because it's an important point. So there's a temporality and an ephemerality involved even in the governance. So the chief minister starts the process, the bureaucrats take it over, and it shifts, which means on a temporal scale, the hierarchies shift. It's a very important learning lesson because in our cities, more than the building, our governance systems are antiquated. That's why now with climate change or floods in Chennai, you don't know how to deal with it because it can't be rapidly responded to. Whereas here they decide, depending on the planning, if it's a long-term view, the politicians do it, then it becomes a 1-year view, the bureaucrats take over. When it's a 6-month view, the Mela Adhikari becomes the boss. That temporality is very interesting for us to learn for in terms of cities as we go forward. And of course, this is the last ritual, milk to the Ma Ganga, the holiest of people, and the city disappears in a week. In 2 weeks this year they said, but in our case it was a week. These are the thatch mats that are left, which then when the monsoon comes, get washed away and there's no memory left of it. So it's mind-blowing that, in that period from October, a whole city for 7 million is built and it's removed. Of course, there are roads with metal plates, there's electricity, there's water supply, there are toilets. I mean, like I said, it's a whole lecture. And there's no memory left of it, it just goes back into the flood. It's formal, it's intentional, it's deliberate. So lots to learn from it. Of course, the feedback we got was, gosh, this has got potential, but if you look at it only as a religious festival, what does that mean? So that challenged us further, and we took on the research and we broadened the kinetic to ephemeral and the city to urbanism. So we made a much broader rubric, in a sense, a rubric which was called ephemeral urbanism, and we looked at cities that were in constant flux. And ephemeral urbanism is a character, I think, it challenges the notion of permanence as a basic condition of cities. And what we argued was really that on this planet, I mean, we did thumb rule calculations and we found that there are approximately 500-600 million people on this planet who live in what we call temporary, ephemeral kinds of conditions. So we felt it was worth a study. And this is just to give you a sense of the kinds of things we looked at. These are the snowbirds that go from cold climates and go into deserts on trailer parks, and they live for 6 months of the thing. Then of course this is the Kumbh Mela itself. These are the cases that we looked at around the world. Amazing amount, the whole book documents all these cases where these kind of temporary settlements occur. And it's just incredibly exhaustive. I mean, this was about 2-3 years of work. And then we made a taxonomy, which is landscapes of religion. So hundreds of them. Of celebration, like Burning Man, many others. Transaction markets, which is what we deal with the most in our lives, especially in this part of the world. And these markets are everywhere. Extraction, mining towns, because they also have a limit. In 50 years, the copper is over, the town moves. So it is temporary, but in a longer period. Military camps, some of them are around for 20 years, and all over the world. They go under the radar. So all this material is from the internet. We found an incredible amount of material from the internet of refuge, which are refugee camps, which are becoming even more prominent now as a phenomenon. And many of them are becoming the new normal, the new permanent, of natural disasters after tsunamis, etc. And they persist for a long time. So the idea was to make a taxonomy because, again, in the way that we talk about ephemeral or we talk about the informal. The favelas from Rio de Janeiro are very different from the slums of Ahmedabad. You can't even put them in one category for economic, political, cultural reasons. So similarly, within the ephemeral landscapes, it's a mistake to just say ephemeral. What is for transaction has a completely different rhythm. Extraction has a completely different rhythm. So for us as architects to intervene, we have to know what that temporality is. And the book then actually documents this in drawings, in very precise metrics. For example, Burning Man and Kumbh, we actually have digitized from Google Maps on AutoCAD the drawing, so you can calculate densities, etc. So you can know running lengths of roads. So the idea is, how do you take what is the temporary, but bring it to the metrics of what planning employs? Then you can actually become more instrumental in what you do. We've taken all this research in the Venice Biennale. We did an installation that was called Does Permanent Matter? And it was made in bamboo and cloth, and the whole installation fitted in 2 suitcases without the bamboo, of course, which was part of the comment on within the permanence of architecture in Biennale. At a Biennale, how does one create a provocation about really the temporary? And this is the book that came out of it, which is called Does Permanence Matter? That's a provocation as part of the book. And more recently, in October, I edited a magazine, the Marg magazine, the special issue. It's on tents, because they wanted to do something on architecture, and I suggested we do it on tents. And here we looked at tents, and so there are scholars who have written on Mughal tents, on textile and tents, but it's also articles on refugee camps, on Fry Auto, on the Hajj terminal. And so basically, the proposition in this issue is that the tent is the most enduring emblem of human settlement, that yet persists in some forms, whether it's in informality or whatever. And this is a drawing of Mughal cities that were actually tested as tents. And the word Urdu means camp because it was the language of the camp. So if you translate Urdu, it means camp. And so the tented city was how cities were settled historically and became models in a way. So we've looked at tents of all kinds. There are scholars like Naman Ahuja who looked at the royal velvet tent, and these were tents for the emperor. We've looked at refugee camps. So the whole issue covers all of this. Protest tents. Then this was a piece I did which was tents as attachments, because if you look at Mughal paintings, for example, what's very prominent is not so much the architecture as much as the fabric, the carpets that extend as awnings. And this is an interesting sketch I found by Charles Correa, who explained how the courtyards in Mughal buildings, actually in the winter, they would let the sun heat the courtyard, and at sundown they would stretch a shamiana. So when you go to Fatehpur Sikri or Agra Fort, you see in the chhajjas, you see big rings. The guide always tells you that was meant for torches so they could light it. Actually, it was meant for shamianas to be strung across it. And in the summer, it would be the opposite. They would keep the shamiana open all night so that the cool air would settle, and then at dawn they would stretch it so the air would stay inside. So the fabrics were a very important part of architecture, and they are ephemeral in that sense, because when we go to Fatehpur Sikri, we just see the raw buildings, but actually that whole layer of fabric and how it created a temporality of spatial experiences was very, very critical. And so it was about the lightness, the agility, the adaptability, and the ephemeral quality that we have celebrated. This is the Hajj terminal. These are modern tents, Shegeruban, Fry Auto. Why do Olympics spend so much money making heavy structures? You're going to have an Olympic here. It should be a tented Olympic with pneumatic structures that will be given to the Olympic committee for the next Olympics, right? They become real white elephants and they disrupt the city completely because they're there for purposes for only a month. And cities don't have the capacity. The Bedouin tents have such an incredible logic in terms they were tent erectors who would study the topography, the wind direction, the sand dunes, and then erect the geometry of the tent, which is what then Fry Auto picks up. In a sense, there's such a similarity between some of these tents and what Fry Auto did at the Munich Olympics. But also ordinary tents. This is a student, a PhD student at Harvard who did a PhD on market tents. And it's just amazing, these patterns of tents in Bangladesh. This is in Dhaka. And there's a whole city that is covered for the period of the festival. And this was a very moving tent done by Dar, which is Sandy Hilal and Alessandro Petti. And this was part of the Sharjah Biennale. We're out in the desert. They made a tent, but it's cast in concrete. You go and sit in it. It's a very moving experience. And in the background, there's a speaker which recites the names of all the children killed in Gaza. And you just sit there in a kind of meditative quality. But theirs was a critique that the tent, the temporary, has now become the permanent, in a sense of refugee camps and people's lives. So it was an art installation, so we kind of included it as part of the issue, and it sits in this landscape, but it's in concrete. It's built in concrete. It's a solid concrete tent. And this image from Dubai, where the tent is yet used for the wedding within this landscape of impatient capital. So it's a provocation that we should be infecting our debates about the obsession with permanence, which we are as human beings, with and these are then linked to what I was calling transitional solutions. Because why are we making permanent solutions for sometimes what might be temporary problems, right? So how do you calibrate that balance is an interesting question. So to zoom out, this is more recent research, and this is called, it's on urban India. I was talking about the proxies. When you look at this proxy for where urbanization is happening, it's very different from when you see the government maps of how our urbanization is happening, right? And so what is urban, what is rural? I think we have completely lost sight of that debate, yeah? And so this is what the government tells you. That's how the dots are small and big dots. Really, in urban India, there are three criteria for making something qualify as a city or a town which has a municipality and has funding and infrastructure. It has to have a population of 5,000 people, it has to have a density of 400 people per square kilometer, and it has to have, this is weird, 75% of the male population is in non-agricultural employment, which means they have to have industries. And if they're in agriculture, if 75, if a majority is in agriculture, it can, even if it's 200,000 people, they don't get the scale. Now that's impossible to discern because everyone is going back and forth between the cities. So the question of flux, right? If you bring flux to demography, our whole criteria for defining urban India goes haywire. And our policies are premised on a reading of urban India, which is not working on the ground, which is what the proxy shows you. So this is how the government tells us what urban India is, big dots and small dots, and it's about 7,523. This is a little old, but it's based on that 12 census. We haven't done the census, so this book has taken me 12 years, so I hope the census doesn't come out, so this is valid. If the census comes out, I think this will be reinforced. I mean, that number will go up. But this is the government imagination of urban India. So, with students at Harvard, at the GSD, what we did was we managed to get data down to the village level for the whole country, and then we specialize this data and try to see where are people really living. And this is very interesting. Don't forget the three criteria: 5,000 people per settlement, 400 people per square kilometer, and 75% of the male population in non-agricultural employment. So what we did was we said, let's separate the criteria and see what urban India looks like. So when we took a minimum population of 5,000 people, that's what urban India looks like. No surprise that Kerala, with continuous urbanization, has a continuous city. There are little pockets here. When we took the criteria of 400 people per square kilometers, which is a density criteria, you have the world's biggest megacity in the Indo-Gangetic Plain. The densities go there up to 8,000 sometimes, right? Greater Houston in America has a density of 240 people per square kilometer. So the lowest density in the Indo-Gangetic Plain is 400 people per square kilometer. It's mind-boggling. So look at already such a difference in the reading of urban India. So what are our policies being founded on? Our policies then should be looking for a kind of paradigm which is partly urban, partly rural, which is what addresses the 350 million people. What you see here in red is 350 million people. It's the entire population of the United States. Yeah? Now, if I take the criteria of 75% of male population, my megacity disappears. Because everyone in the megacity is coming to Ahmedabad for half the year, Bombay to drive a taxi for the other half of the year, etc. They're not 75% in agriculture. It's a completely different reading of urban India. Except for Kerala, that stays constant, everything changes. So where are the investments going? Where are we putting our airports? What are the train system? What is that Bombay-Mumbai, Ahmedabad corridor? What is it kind of saying? What is the criteria that we are using? It's a fundamental question that this research is bringing up. So when you talk about the pandemic, we use the word migration even for internal movement, which is bizarre. But as you know, government said 11 million people walked back. I think IIM Ahmedabad did a research, they came up with a number of 30 million people. They all walk back here, right? That's where they are doing partly this work and partly that work. And that was a great indication of this flux that I was talking about. Therefore, why is this even important? It's important because, so let's say for housing, we are obsessed. You look at any developer, you look at any board in India, anywhere, what is the metric? 3 BHK, 2 BHK, 1 BHK, right? That's the metric. Housing is imagined in those terms. That assumes the nuclear family, right? Now, if you actually, what we need YMCA type dharamshalas, community living for migrants who come, otherwise they're living in slums. That's what they're doing, they're renting places in slums. Our whole paradigm for housing has to be rethought within the profession. I mean, I put this onus on the profession. We have to change that conversation to another imaginary of housing. Because the 1 BHK, 2 BHK, it's middle class, it's nuclear family assumption. So you can rethink amenities. So going back to that holy trinity of dwelling, livelihoods, and mobility and amenities, you can rethink that whole typology based on research like this, because it tells you there's a whole different pattern that is existing in terms of where our demand for housing is. So we are solving the slum problem, I believe, completely incorrectly, because we are making them 1 BHK, 2 BHK, 3 BHK, which is not half most of the market there. So what the research is proposing is what we are calling transitioning settlements. This number would be at about 250 million now. It would be about 20% of the Indian population. there are 15,000 what I call transitioning settlements. This is a terminology that we are using in this new book, which I hope will be out soon. And what that means is that there are 15,000 places in India that range from populations of 50,000 to 200,000, which is a lot, 2 lakhs, which have all the attributes of an urban center, but they're defined by the government as a village. So which means they've been run by a panchayat, they don't have a municipality. So what they are essentially, that is the urban time bomb India is sitting on, because this is the public health time bomb. This is where your disease and your public health is going to explode and it will be uncontrollable. And these transitioning settlements, I'm not showing all the research, none of these transitioning settlements are more than a 2-hour bus ride from what is an urban center of a substantial size, which means they are operating and they will continue to operate, and so we have to move into a much more network urban imaginary to encompass these settlements within the imagination of the big and the small dots. They're getting left out of that. So it's a whole different spatial imaginary of what urbanization would be. The book is called Becoming Urban. I hope we'll be able to finish it soon. And it is looking at these emerging patterns. So there are many maps like this that show these disjunctures of where investment is going versus where population actually exists and need that investment. And so from that research, many things become clear. Which are the poorest states become clear, where you have the valley of the Indo-Gangetic Plain. All of this maps clearly. And like I said, sanitation and open defecation, all of that, as you see, is aggregated in places which are the poorest, but that also have the highest density, but also have the maximum amount of transitioning settlements where there's no infrastructure. And this is very important for not just architects and planners, the government, for policy, for business entrepreneurs, for everyone, because these are talking about new opportunities that exist in a sense. And so sanitation as a form of inequity has become really, really, really acute. I know the present government and the Prime Minister have done an amazing job to bring this central stage, but I believe that it's being solved through an absolutism and a solutions. It has to be thought in more transitionary terms, because this is what the result of it is, that you have mass-produced toilets that are put outside people's homes. You will see the disparity of that binary. This is this young boy telling his grandfather to use what is like a telephone booth in London. So these have to be culturally much more attuned, and the transition would be community toilets, because it's impossible to get a single toilet into each one of these houses, right? So transitionary thinking would mean that you use public community toilets as a way to make a transition to individual toilets when you solve the housing problem. And so this research, we've called it sanitation as infrastructure. These are labs that have been running at Harvard, which is looking at data, looking at how much revenue is generated by toilets where they charge you, like the Sulabs and things like that. It's a huge amount of monies, which actually, if done more intelligently, can create fantastic infrastructure. That's how people help themselves. That's a community toilet, which is inappropriately designed. It's a design problem. Actually, it's a spatial design problem, which we haven't addressed. We've treated it like an industrial product design problem, it's a spatial design problem. And so therefore, these transitions before transformations is the way to kind of see it, which we are not doing. And so one of the things we took up on ourselves was we got funds from the Tata Trust, a small amount, and we said, let's imagine what we call a sanitation hub. Let's not call it a community toilet or a pub, but it's a sanitation hub, which can have clinics, it can have, it's the best lab. You can pick urine from there, and you can pick fecal matter, and you can tell if the community is well or not, what diseases are prevalent, right? So you can have a path lab right in it. So how does one imagine it more broadly? And these are what we call the ecology of sanitation, because it has to do with hygiene, waste, water, health. These are interconnected. So we were trying to see how one can come up with more complex matrices. And then we took 2 sites, one a transitioning settlement, what I just explained to you, looked at the materials that were available, and actually came up with a prototype. I'm just giving you glimpses of things, so sorry if I'm going fast, but how could this be embedded in those communities without having the stigma of a public toilet. Because even the solabs and all, they've become the new landmarks of our building. I mean, I hear people saying, let's meet outside the solab. It's like a landmark. Whereas these actually should be embedded within communities in a way that they are like Trojan horses where sanitation could be used. And then we took one in a high density, looked at the materials, looked at the possibilities of land parcels, and came up with imaginations of how that could be embedded. So therefore, what I just showed you was research, theory, pedagogy, because some of this is teaching, but I'm coming now to advocacy. These are my books on Bombay, many of which I did with Sharda Dwivedi, who was a close friend. She passed away 6 or 8 years ago. We did a lot of work trying to create awareness in Mumbai, starting in 1992. We did books on the history, on particular styles, on World Heritage styles. We also did walking tours, basically to create an awareness. All of that led to the first heritage regulations in India in 1995, which protects areas as well as buildings, and the whole fort area got defined as a precinct, which is of historic value. And in a post-colonial condition, when the narratives of the colonizer is different from the narratives of the colonized, we are now the custodians of that environment, and so we cannot, the mistake we make in post-colonial conditions is we use the narratives of the colonizers, of the creators. So we say, English heritage said this is significant. It means nothing to people. I mean, who cares if Queen Victoria walked through the arcade? We don't. So what are the narratives as the custodians of that environment that we create, which is this notion that significance, and this is where I come back to theory, we are told, okay, you have to discern the significance because the British were there, because they did this, it's important. But I argue that we should construct the significance. It's like identity, we construct our identity. At independence, our identity was totally linked to the values Gandhi brought, right? I couldn't say that for the identity of India today, for example, right? Identity changes with every generation, and so does significance. So we don't have to blindly take the narratives of the colonizers. We as custodians can create that significance, which is what we started doing in Mumbai. So the whole Kala Ghoda area, which was never an art district, we made it an art district because there were galleries, because that became the contemporary engine by which we could transform and conserve the buildings. We posed this as a banking district because 30 banks were headquartered there, as a corporate district, as a shopping mall, as a tourist district. And those narratives then, we used to write in the newspaper, that it's supposed to become an art district. It began to construct a new significance for it. So it was a form of advocacy that came out of the research. The research was, therefore, that's what I meant by propositional, where you connect dots to hope something will be achieved from it. And so that's how the festival was born, street furniture, signage, all of that came out of the money we raised. This was money from the festival. Hussain painted a memory of the Kala Ghoda for us, and that was sold at auction. From that money, we began to do improvements there, because in the state's mind, it was very low priority. Grade 1 building, Abha Narayan restored it, but we raised the money. So these were my roles as a client, as part of this advocacy, putting these dots together, raising money, creating a condition for this to happen. And therefore, it became an art district with even contemporary interventions. The museum got appropriated in it, and then popularizing it through books like walking tours, which were also done in Marathi, reflecting on the legislation through conferences to see what were the lacunas in the legislation. And that led to being appointed by the Tata Group to do this project, which was the most difficult but very interesting project we did, which was to write a conservation master plan for the Taj Mahal, which was my steepest learning curve. And having grown up knowing that after Shah Jahan built this, he cut people's fingers, he blinded people, I said, I'm not going to do this alone. So I started a company called the Taj Mahal Conservation Collaborative, which had just an incredible group of people, and we collectively embarked on thinking about the Taj differently. And that's Bernard Fielden, who was a guru. He passed away a few years ago. They're conservation architects. This is the ASI. That's Ebba Koch, who is a premier Mughal historian. These are people from the ASI, Bernard Fielden, and many others. And we collectively did workshops. We took 6 months to think through what we should do. And we said we won't touch the Taj, it doesn't need touching. But we identified everything around the Taj, including the riverside wall, which had sand to the top. So I'll just tell you this story, which is, I think, very interesting. We also looked at the gardens, because The gardens were, this is a nursery, Kanayalam, which provided the plants for the gardens here. It was part of the ecology, and also Mehtab Bagh, which I'll just tell you about in a second. So, what we discovered was the Taj. You know, all of us who go to the Taj go here, we get a glimpse of the Taj, we take that selfie, we go here, we are dehydrated, we climb up there, we go home, right? It's like a one-liner, the Taj. The Taj, as a design idea, went all the way across. That was, you see the squares? This had hexagons in it. Char Bagh, the Taj, Mehtab Bagh. We all grew up knowing there was a black Taj here, complete nonsense. It was a reflecting pond, which was a moonlit garden, which had a reflecting pond where the emperor sat here on a moonlit night, and he saw the reflection of the Taj in that pool on a full moonlight. That's why it's called Mehtab Bagh. Liz Moynihan, who was Daniel Moynihan, who was the ambassador, US ambassador, his wife took it upon herself to get this excavated. So the narrative of the Taj goes across this band. It's just fascinating. This was never the entrance for the emperor. The emperor came by boat and came through a little door here. That's why the riverside wall had to be torn out, because that was the main entrance of the. It wasn't meant to be a public. It was his place for grief. He invited some guests to come in from here once in a while to be in Paradise Garden, which was the orchard. This is what it's got reduced to. It's a one-liner. This was the result of the Agra Regiment Band, which was a very well-known band. They decided they wanted to play on the plinth in the evening so the Memsabs could sit on the lawn and picnic. That was the request. And Curzon, Lord Curzon, made this lawn. So this lawn is not authentic at all. The ground level here was 6 feet below the pathway. It was an orchard. So if you walked on the pathway, the mangoes were at your nose level. You could smell and pluck a fruit. It was an orchard in which the Taj floated. It was Paradise Garden. This is far from Paradise Garden. This is an image I found in the CCA in Canada, just before the British were going to dismantle it to sell the marble, and then they stopped doing that. But this was the unkept orchard. So the design idea of the Taj, and I'm speaking as a designer now, was this was Jannat, which is you came into Paradise Garden, it's white and taut because it was floating. So all of you who've been to the Taj, when you approach the Taj, it's so clumsy going up a steep stair on the platform, right? That wasn't designed to be for guests. No one was supposed to come there. You came into Paradise Garden and saw this white monument floating in the garden. You were supposed to have arrived in heaven. That was the imagery by which it was propelled. And that's why the orchard was important, that's why the nursery was important, and the emperor came from the other side. Miniature paintings, later ages picked that, but there's not that much evidence. So this is a book we did, Amita Beg and I, which caught what we called it multiple narratives. So this tells all the alternate stories of the Taj, which otherwise are not available to us. This is a map of Jaipur, so it gets even more interesting, the story. This is a map of Jaipur. Now, sorry, it's called the Jaipur map of Agra because it was commissioned by the Maharaja of Jaipur. And this shows, this is the Taj. You see the river? It's turbulent because when the snow melted in the Himalayas, this was a river of amazingly fresh water and it was very turbulent. So this was the Taj. That's Taj Ganj. That's the forecourt. Look at where the Taj is projected. It's projected here. So that was the elevation of the Taj because the emperor came from the river. Otherwise the Taj would have been projected to be seen from here. This is Mehtab Bagh, which was partly there. Now, notice all of this, right? That is very interesting because when you zoom out, you see this. This is the Taj. And these Agra Fort. These are all pleasure gardens. Right? So what the emperor was essentially doing was that the elite in Agra all had a pleasure garden here, and the law didn't allow inheritance of land. So the loophole, the tricky loophole the kids of the elite found was they said they would bury their fathers and mothers on the land of the pleasure garden, so that then the emperor would have empathy and say, okay, your family can look after the garden. So if you go to Itmat Dollah's tomb, which is an example of this, The decoration on the tomb is wine glasses and flowers and things. It was basically a party plot, to use the simple term. These are all party plots, and that's how they found the loophole. So the emperor had to upend all his disciples. So he said he's going to build the biggest party plot at the end of this. So this was the last one. And here there's the last building here is called the Aga Khan's palace, not the Aga Khan of the Ismailis. He was a eunuch who looked after Shah Jahan's harem. So he's been put in a place that he can watch all of this. So that's the story of this whole part of Agra. It must have been the most wonderful waterfront in the world because it had snowy water, it had hammams. We've documented all of these, they have hammams, etc. And this was a pleasure mile. It's like here, what do you got, the billionaires street or whatever. So similarly, this was like the billionaires mile for Agra in a sense, right? And these are some of the photographs we did again with Dinesh Mehta. This is Hikmatwalla's tomb, and the water is here. These are hammams that go below. Some of these fragments exist. You know, Agra has one, it doesn't even have a tourist night. People go in the morning from Delhi and come back in the evening. You could change the economy of Agra if this waterfront was developed. Tourism would be incredible because each of these monuments are really worth looking. We took a boat and it documented the whole waterfront. It's in fragments, but it's stunningly beautiful. The water is 1 foot deep here. We have to go in a flat canoe. They can easily modulate the water with damming again and flush it all out. It would be a mind-boggling project, but because I guess it, anyway. So, you know, Eva Koch and other scholars have talked about this, but what we did was a very accurate mapping to show the conditions of it. It's again a whole book, so I'm not going to go into the detail. This is the state of the state there. Unfortunately, this is the book where we called it Planning for Conservation and how one could revive the city. It was a big team that worked on it. This is all from the GSD. And this is part of the labs I do there. It's called Extreme Urbanism. I'm on my 10th one, which take wicked problems in India, largely in Mumbai. We've done Agra, we did one in Afghanistan, to see how one can actually bring design and spatial imagination to open up new conversations about this. So this is a series, and during the pandemic, I said, where in South Asia could I go virtually? So we went to Ishkashim in Afghanistan. We got photographers and videographers on the ground in real time to walk the students through the street. It was a fantastic model actually of pedagogy through virtual learning, and we actually worked on the valley in Afghanistan. So really this collection of books on the city, this is on urbanism and this is on advocacy for Mumbai and the Taj Mahal, have been my sort of engagement with the city. In this last part, I'll just go through architecture very quickly because I think that would be of interest. So in India since 1992, since we liberalized our economy, actually the process of getting to a place rather than the destination is what we have invested in. So our highways have become great, our bullet trains, our things, but we don't bother about where we arrive. It is the process of reaching somewhere that has got much more state thing. And architecture has got such a back role in the point. So you go through fantastic infrastructure and then you arrive at a place that you're completely demotivated. You're not even sure whether you're in Hyderabad or Jaipur because there is nothing that even tells you. So we were trying to look through this book, Architecture in India since 1990, which is when we liberalized what is really happening. And we came down to 4 forms of practice. One is the architecture of impatient capital, which I told you about. You see it happening everywhere. Of local assertions, and these are architects who have the wherewithal to deal with the impatience of capital but create beautiful buildings. Doshi from Ahmedabad, Charles Correa, Raj Reval. They are architects who began to try to find a voice for architecture in India given the largeness of capital and other things. And then sustainable architecture, which is, say, Laurie Baker, there's Chitra and Chitra Vishwanathan in Bangalore, my friend sitting right here. I mean, there are people who, actually are working with new protocols in terms of instruction. So when the architecture of impatience is what you make drawings, you email it to a contractor, they build it, there's a complete disconnect from the site. The architects, which are about more local assertions, are sensitive to locality, are reading culture, but yet following the modes that are of global capital. Architects work within the sustainable mode are even forming new forms of instruction and therefore creating and captivating skill sets which are otherwise not possible. And now many architects are combining these many modes. So while you're working with craftsmen directly and instructing them, you're also making more important moves of structure, of services through other modes. I mean, my argument is these modes must all collapse. They're all simultaneously valid, but when they become singular, they become very absolute in what they can do. So even the sustainable, it has a scale question then. To go above a scale, you move into other forms of instruction. And therefore, how can one create models that collapse and they're not singular is the question. And then the last one, which it occurred to me, were faith-based practices. And I realized that the biggest projects happening in India in the 1990s were faith, Akshardham, temples, etc. They were bigger than any convention center we were building. I mean, till Mr. Modi's stadium came here, maybe that was big. But so really we basically looked at the book and structuring it as global practices, regional manifestation, alternate practices, and counter-modernism. It's a way to understand the disparity we see in the big built environment, right? So you go in Ahmedabad, it's very common, you drive in a society and you see a Jain temple being crafted in the most beautiful way, and then you come next and there's a glass building that's coming up right next to it, or an Audi showroom right next to the temple. So you don't know which century you're living in if you just go by the images you're seeing. And so to understand that, we began to break it down in these sorts of models. And this led to a big exhibition we did at the NGMA. And I bring this up just to show you a few observations. And it was many events. It ran for 60, there were 60 events over 2 months. A lot of conversation and many things came up. And I'll just show you one example of the kinds of, this is an infographic which has a lot of complex data. It was a whole wall at the NGMA, but I want to just show you something, which is this graph that you see here, right? What you see listed here are the schools of architecture at Independence 1 or 2, right? It keeps growing, right? Now we have 420 schools, something like that. They close down, they open, I don't know. So you see how much the schools of architecture since independence have gone. What you see as a graph here in blue is the growth of real estate as an organized sector. And that really jumps up at our liberalization in 92, right? You suddenly see the graph going. And what you see is the growth of schools is directly related to the growth of the real estate sector. Now, so what happens is parents are driving their kids around the city, there are buildings coming up everywhere. They say, beta, architecture is the thing to do, and then the school demands go up. Actually, what we learn from this is the demand for schools of architecture is inversely proportionate to the growth of real estate. So what I mean by that is, let's take Defense Colony in Bombay, or take any society here. You know, the 500 plots, right? People are sold the plots in the model I showed you. You know, one family goes to an architect sometimes. 10 families might go to the same architect, so at least 50 architects will be employed in the making of the colony. When you have high-rise buildings and located, one developer has an in-house architect and they're building for 2,000 families. So actually there's no demand for architects. And that's why interns can't get internships. We're all struggling, right? And so it's completely wrong in that imagination. So how does one actually articulate that position? Because we don't need more schools of architecture if we go by the organized real estate model versus the more incremental, high-rise, low-density, where people have plots on which they can build. So, you know, these are very fundamental patterns that we must as a profession discern, whether it's design, whether it's business, whether it's planning, whether it's architecture, because otherwise you don't know where you're intervening and your interventions are completely wrong. So this is just that graph that shows you in more detail. And so this was called the state of architecture. We then followed it up with the thing on state of housing, where we looked at what was happening similarly in the housing sector. We documented 80 projects with plans, sections, where we showed who built it, how much time the project took. This is the chawls in Bombay, etc. The BDD chawls, which are now high-rise, of course. So this is again a way to discern patterns, so whether it's for educators or whether it's for us as professionals, the landscape of where we intervene. What are the models of engagement by which we intervene? Do we stay with policy? Do we actually look at spatial design? Even the thing I said about 1B, 2B, it changes how you imagine housing completely if you know the demand is completely different. And so that's what this research is sort of aimed at. These are parts of those 80 portfolios which show this. Also, institutional ecology for housing delivery. There is a very small area where the private sector and the public sector overlap. And so they are both operating on their own. If they overlap more, we would come up with the right solutions in terms of how housing types are married to the nature of planning policy. It's completely detached. That's why you're seeing just things coming up everywhere. There's no infrastructure. The city is not coming together. If you think about it, in any city, 90% of the fabric of any city, or any great city that you can think of, 90% of the fabric of any great city is housing. It's about 10% that are buildings that are, let's say, iconic or foreground buildings. I call them foreground buildings, right? So a church is a foreground building, a museum is a foreground building, but any great city, 90% of the fabric is housing. And if we don't get that fabric right, the city just doesn't come together. What is happening in Ahmedabad and Mumbai, every building wants to be a foreground building. No one wants to be a background. So you don't have fabric then. You don't have the continuity. It's all disrupted because everyone wants to be a foreground building because that's capital which is impatient to sell itself, right? So the impatience of capital, I mean, when capital resides in foundations, when it resides in institutions, it gains patience. And therefore, the collaboration between private and public sector and civil society is very important because it makes capital patient. Only then can you find the right solutions. Otherwise, you get the disruptions that we are getting. And then we looked at the 30 square meter unit, which is the metric the government uses as the minimum, and what you can do in it is disastrous, and how you aggregate it is worse. And we've now also moved into looking at South Asia. This is a conference we did looking at South Asia, which was the last conference for the state of housing. We said, let's invite our neighbors and see what they're doing. It was quite an operation getting people from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, all of that area. And we did a whole 2 days of collaborating and understanding their perspective, which now at the GSD we have taken up as a project with 2 former students. Some of them might have been your colleagues, they were your colleagues. And here Dhruv was involved in this project for the many beginning parts of it. He's here in the audience, where during the pandemic, we did a virtual lecture series looking at architects under 40 years and seeing through South Asia what are the patterns that might help them in terms of models of architecture. So we looked at all the countries in South Asia and we did a lecture series publication. It's a whole project that is ongoing and this is the structure of the project. These are some of the practices that emerged as a result. They're all under 40. This is a conference we did in Delhi and made it an exhibition. These are the kinds of sessions we had. We had people, again, 38 participants and speakers from all over South Asia in Delhi in December. This became a book which is called Architectures of Transition, which captures these 41 practices. We didn't do 40 because I was scared the publisher would call it 40 under 40, so we made it 41, which is nicer. 40 under 40 is too absolute, right? So, this is now a traveling exhibition, this is what is in the book. This is how the projects are kind of reflected and documented. And this is amazing what the work we've seen. We've done comparative plans so people know the sizes. We've done demographies. These are the areas from the middle of India we couldn't get too many. This is where the practices, the new practices, so to speak, we found. We looked at the patterns of practices. How big are they? How many employees do they have? What is the size of the practice? How long did they start? What are the kind of clientele? What is the mix of residential and institutional? So that the new generation gets some indication of what their peers are doing. And then who are the patrons? What are the kinds of projects they're doing? So this is all mapped in a way that for a young practitioner, they can see where their trajectory is situated given the current trends that they might. And what I found very interesting is the spectrum of concerns of this generation has broadened enormously. They engage with sites of conflict, they're advocating for public spaces, they're mitigating climate change, they're reimagining affordable housing, underrepresented community, resilience, rethinking new forms of infrastructure. And their modes of engagement are also non-traditional, multidisciplinary, cross-subsidy. Within their offices, they're subsidizing work for the poor, Robin Hood kind of thing, then co-creating with communities, cross-disciplinary. For my generation, we always had 1 or 2 outliers. In these 40 40 we took as a sample, 41 we found it was enormously present in many practices, that they were working across the spectrum. And I hope the book like this would encourage others to look at it. This exhibition is traveling. It's been to Mumbai, Delhi. It came to Ahmedabad only as a book discussion. There were some of you who participated in the conversations. It's gone to Calicut, Cochin. It's going to Afghanistan, then to Lahore, Karachi. And after that, in a year, we are going to end it in Mumbai, and we are hoping we can add 50 or 60 others. So if anyone wants to, we've sent out a call to nominate. You can nominate yourself, you can nominate friends, but we want to actually do a major show of at least 100 practices, so that the younger community here gets an exposure to people who could potentially be clients and patrons. So that will be a one-year project. So please nominate. So I just want to end by saying that I'm now beginning to reflect on my writings, my research, and I'm beginning to see how it begins to form a practice-based reflection, a research-based reflection, advocacy-based books, and I call these instruments of advocacy. I don't even pretend that some of these are scholarly. Some people say some of them have scholarly material, but for me these are instruments of advocacy, where one can get, as a professional, a voice in society, where one can actually hope to change the conversation through peers who are in pedagogy, or through other people, younger sort of generation, etc. And so in this last Venice Biennale, we did an installation on this, on the books, so as practice, as research, just to say that it's as important to think about the context you're working in as actually building and intervening in that context, and what might be a serious way to engage with that aspect. And then what we did was we actually took all our publications, looked at the themes, looked at where the overlaps are, and this is work in progress, to see how one might actually create the interlinkages, what I was talking about, propositional research, where research of seemingly unconnected things begin to inform each other. So like I talked to you about the flux and the movement in urban India, that of course has a clear parallel in just reimagining housing, reimagining amenities. So from each of these, how can one extract stuff that can change the conversation, but at least help maybe younger architects and us as a community to think about the problems differently, and in what we intervene. So this is really where then the modes of engagement, I think, becomes another important question, which is how one can actually collapse these, so not have them as binaries. So for me, for example, I don't see the difference between architecture, urban design, urban planning. I go crazy when people put you in those silos, because I think if you think as a planner, how it affects your architecture is enormous. And I think architecture can be informed by that to make it much, much, much richer. And so it really, for me, what has happened in the world today, the last two slides, sorry, is that our spheres of concern have expanded exponentially, right? I mean, we can sit over a drink in the evening and talk about inequity, climate change, all the big problems that surround us. I'm talking about architects, not now. But our spheres of influence are diminishing, because we literally, I know as a practitioner, even when I was starting, I would spend my evenings doing research and talking about big ideas. In the morning, I was going and fighting with my carpenter because of a small interior I was going to add to someone's kitchen or something, right? So there's a huge difference between our spheres of concern and our spheres of influence. And I think research, if taken in this way, propositional research, can be a way we can calibrate somewhat this big disparity that is occurring for all of us between our spheres of influence and concern, so which is how do you instrumentalize your agency. And I feel that this kind of research that I've shared with you some of it, is that I think for me it has been a way for me to instrumentalize my own agency in terms of how one can actually intervene. And for me, I have to yet reflect on it, I'm not sure, but I think it has affected the way I think of buildings and what I prioritize in terms of investment in buildings, whether it's materials or costs or types, has been influenced very much by this. So I just end with this wonderful Polish chess grandmasters. Tactics is knowing what to do when there's something to do. Strategy is knowing what to do when there's nothing to do. And I think research as practice can be a very important instrument in achieving that goal. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
spectacle always. I think spectacles by nature are about the collective, So I think they necessarily operate at another scale, right? But what art can do, and what I believe art does, is it's another lens to the world, no? So literature is another lens to the world. It's another way. I mean, Salman Rushdie telling stories in a particular way, bringing magic realism. It's a way that you start seeing the world differently, right? And I think any form of good art does that. It actually gives you a critique on the world, whether it was Picasso. I mean, some more intellectualize it, some do it more intuitively, but it's necessarily a critique of the world. And so I think spectacle by nature is about the collective. It is about creating something which is representing the collective in a particular way. And that's why, for me, the ephemeral Durga Puja, or even Navratri, or even the Ganesh festivals, these are spectacles of the collective, and they're ephemeral and they leave no trace, right? When architecture, and in the West, because of capital and over-accumulation of capital, a lot of the spectacles codified through architecture become permanent, right? Now, what their life will be, Notre Dame has a life that has gone many hundreds of years, and other things just fall by the wayside, right? So even historically, what has survived of monuments historically are the ones that were about the spectacle, whether they were temples or monuments or otherwise. The ordinary fabric, the 90% of the housing, often leaves no trace. Whether you go to Vijayanagar, what do you see are the spectacular moments of that civilization or that moment in history. So I think, in my reading at least, I might be wrong, and I'm happy to engage in a broader conversation, spectacle is more about the collective. So I think the singular object, part of the problem in today is every object wants to contribute to that spectacle. That's what I meant by everything wants to be foreground. And so our cities are all foreground. We need background. Background is what will add more value to the foreground. And that calibration, I think urban design is an important instrument which we haven't paid premium to here. I studied it, I teach it, I struggle with it, but it's just not, it is the critical bridge between the small object of architecture, which is about site specificity, and the abstraction of planning, which is about orchestrating the broader landscape, right? And urban design is about resolving those disparate contestations in space. And so what is the scale at which you call something a spectacle? I think we have to have a bigger conversation on. We should be spending more energy figuring that. Otherwise we feel the burden on everything. We want to make street furniture that's a spectacle, right? Everyone's doing that. I think we should leave that to art. Art is more effective in doing that, or artists are more effective. I don't know, does that answer your question somewhat? Somewhat, okay. To be continued, okay. That was what I got from your facial expressions.
We began with talking about predictive futures,
yeah.
And then we went through this whole lot of research, looking at the present in a sense.
But in a projective way, to see what
it can be used for, what would it mean.
Yeah.
So while I was coming here, I was having a conversation with someone about how our cities are looking the same.
Yeah.
And so, looking into the future, how do you see that transforming?
Very good question. I think our cities have become acontextual. I think our greatest hope is the shift in the narrative that will happen with our acceptance slowly of climate change and what climate means, right? I mean, growing up, and I'll say that of all the other people of my age in this thing, you took air and water for granted, right? Today, we just can't take, those are two things you can't take for granted. What a shift, right? So we have forgotten context, and that's why I said to complicate the context is going to be very important in the ways we nourish the way we think about the built environment, right? I'm going to Tuesday to Delhi. There's a big conference that Harvard University is doing with the government of India. Rajan from CEPT is going to be there, people like that. And they've thinned it down to the question of heat. They said, see, climate change is everything. It's like sustainability. I mean, the business school people say sustainability means making more money regularly, right? That's a sustainable economy. But actually you could do a conference where you gave people from 12 disciplines the word sustainability, they would interpret it completely differently. That's what's happening with climate change. It's become this very amorphous thing that everything seems to fit in. So we have to, as professionals, when all of us as citizens, have to get very precise about that, right? So we are doing this conference which is just heat. What is the effect of heat on public health? What is the effect of heat on the built environment? So I think now we have to nourish, or we have to challenge ourselves with some real problems where the future is precise. This is where I think accepting the precision of the future will hold us in good. There's no point going back and looking at Jaisalmer again. Of course, there are wonderful lessons to do there, but there's too much that has got disrupted. So the precision, in the same way as the future has got so precise, we have to get very precise in the way we deal with the future. You know, as far as the built environment goes, the developers are the ones who live the furthest in the future. I mean, they're living in the future in the way that capital will accumulate and get value. Architects are looking at precedents from the past. And so I think this is a big shift we have to make, which is not to say that we'll forget history, because then you're going to repeat it as has been said, but that we don't use it as such a baggage that doesn't allow us to think more boldly and speculatively about the future. That's why I think the notion of pure research versus propositional research will free us a little bit. Otherwise, we don't use proxies in the academy. You know, what do they say that my colleagues hate this when I say this. They say when you have a paper which has 2-3 footnotes, they call it plagiarism. Like if you do a paper which has 20 footnotes, they say it's synthesis. When you do a paper that has 500 footnotes, they call it original work, right? It's exactly the opposite of what should happen, right? So I think we've been weighed down by protocols and cultures, whether it's the academy or elsewhere. We've done away with making as an instinct. We have to recalibrate all of this and get a little more. You see, I mean, sorry, this sounds like a lecture, stop me, but you see what happened with modernism really was that modernism had an arrogance because it was about building a new world. In places like India, Africa, Latin America, there was a disjuncture because what really happened was that aesthetic modernity, whether it's through the arts or through architecture, arrived here before the social modernization process. In Europe, the aesthetics of modernity came out of a social modernization project, the creation of a bourgeois economy, etc., etc. Right? So the big disjuncture to start with. So here it got translated as a brave new world, Nehru building Chandigarh, for good political reasons to ban a nation, an idea of India that didn't exist, right? So modernism was seen as a very arrogant kind of disposition in terms of imagining the built environment. And then in the 70s and 80s, well, not even 70s, 80s and 90s, in India, I think it coincides with the emergency in the 1980s, architecture gets challenged by the social sciences, right? Because we see poverty, we see slums, there are activists who begin to bring another sensitivity to architecture. In that we've lost out because we've got very unnerved now. So therefore, the confidence within the profession to speculate about the future got kind of unhinged. I'm not saying it has to go back to its arrogance, but I think it has to build a foundation from which it can build more confidently to look into the future, the kind of precision view that you're suggesting, I was suggesting. And I think that is the big challenge. Sorry, such a long answer.
A large part of it also comes from kind of like for instance, one of the things that you kind of showed, which was the Jaipur map of Agra.
Yeah.
So stuff like that also completely changes the way in which one would envision larger policy making of developments. So maybe something of that sort also helps with speculating futures.
Yeah, because you know, narratives get constructed,
yeah,
and that's why the past is becoming so unsettled, because either they're genuine narratives that have been left out, like the old subaltern studies and all of that, other voices, or it's being politically reinterpreted for reasons of populism, etc. So it's got completely unhinged. So the narratives, so the Taj Mahal, for whatever reasons of tourism, the narrative that was well a monument of love, it actually, the scholars have written fantastic scholarship on the fact that nothing to do with romance, in a sense. Shah Jahan, I mean, so you know, the only thing that's asymmetrical in the Taj Mahal is the tombs under the dome. Because he meant it for himself. He was the emperor of the world. That tomb was meant for him. His young wife, 13th child she was giving birth to, died, and in a moment of sorrow, he put her in the center. Then he had to